All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're talking about something called deep metric learning. And trust me, it's a super cool field where we're basically teaching AI not just to look at things, but to actually understand what it means for two things to be similar.
You know, it all starts with a question you've probably asked yourself. How in the world does your phone know it's your face and not someone else's? It feels like magic, right? But it's not. The secret is all about teaching a machine to measure similarity. And that, right there, is the big problem deep metric learning is trying to solve.
So let's break that down. Deep metric learning, or DML for short, is really the art of teaching an AI to create a kind of similarity map. Think of it like a giant digital map. The whole goal is to get a neural network to put things on this map so that stuff that's alike, say two photos of you, ends up right next to each other. And stuff that's different, like your face and mine, gets pushed way, way far apart.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the most basic way to learn, using pairs and triplets. Then we'll get into a really clever shortcut using something called Proxies. After that, we're going to get a little weird and ask if our map is even the right shape to begin with. And finally, we'll check out some amazing real-world examples of all this in action.
Okay, so how do you even start teaching a computer what similar means? Well, the most obvious way, the first step, is just by direct comparison. Showing it a few examples at a time.
And one of the most classic ways to do this is something called triplet loss. You've probably heard of it from systems like Google's FaceNet. The whole idea is pretty simple, actually. You learn from a set of three images. You've got your anchor, that's our starting point, then a positive, which is the same thing, like another picture of the same person, and finally a negative, a picture of someone totally different. The learning here is basically just a game of push and pull. The model's job is to tweak its internal map to do two things. One, pull the anchor and the positive closer together, and two, push the anchor and the negative further apart. That's it. This constant little dance of pushing and pulling based on just those three images is how the machine learns. Now, the great thing about triplet loss is how simple it is. I mean, it's a really powerful concept, but, and this is a big but, it has a huge problem, something called the sample mining bottleneck. See, the model doesn't learn anything from easy examples. To actually get smarter, you have to feed it hard triplets, cases where the negative image looks almost identical to the anchor.
And that's where things get tricky. I mean, think about it. If you have a data set with millions or even billions of images, trying to find those perfectly hard triplets, well, it's literally like trying to find a needle in a haystack. It's a massive computational headache, and it just slows everything down.
So that bottleneck got researchers thinking. There has to be a better way, right? And that brings us to our next big idea, proxies. This is all about working smarter, not harder.
Just to recap, the big issue with triplet loss is that you're always comparing one specific sample to another specific sample. It's all very local, and it's just not very efficient when you're dealing with huge amounts of data. So what if we just flipped the script entirely? Instead of comparing one photo to millions of other photos, what if we compared it to a single perfect representative for each class? And that, my friends, is the genius behind proxy-based methods. Each class, let's say my face, gets its own proxy, its own representative on that similarity map. So now, instead of that whole needle in a haystack search for triplets, the model's job is much simpler. Just pull an image closer to its correct proxy and push it away from all the other proxies. It's a much cleaner, way more efficient way of doing things. Okay, so we figured out a smarter way to compare things on our map, but this brings up an even bigger, kind of mind-bending question. All this time, we've just been assuming our map is flat, like a sheet of paper. In math terms, that's called a Euclidean space. But what if our data doesn't want to live on a flat map? What if the map itself is the wrong shape? Yeah, this is a really interesting problem with these flat maps. It turns out that a lot of standard models have this weird tendency to cram everything towards the center of the map. In a field like genomics, they call this cell crowding, and it's a huge issue because distinct types of cells get all squished together and you can't tell them apart anymore.
And it's not just a hunch. We've got research, like this quote from a paper called Skin Sphere, that basically says if your data is naturally curved, trying to flatten it out onto a Euclidean space is going to cause a ton of distortion. You're basically hiding the true relationships between your data points. A flat map just isn't the right tool for the job.
So what's the solution? Well, researchers are now playing with different shapes for their maps. Instead of that flat Euclidean space, they might use a spherical space. Think of the surface of a globe. It's perfect for avoiding that crowding issue we just talked about. Or if you have data that has a kind of family tree structure, like how cells develop, you might use a hyperbolic space.
It's kind of saddle-shaped and gives you way more room to map out all those branching relationships. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, right? We've got learning from triplets, these clever proxy shortcuts, and even picking the right shape for our map. Now for the fun part. Let's see how all this stuff actually works in the real world.
And believe me, the applications are everywhere. This is the tech that powers face recognition. You know, when you search for similar images online, that's this. It's even used for something called person re-identification, which is tracking someone across a bunch of different security cameras. And, as we've already hinted, it's completely changing the game in fields like genomics.
Let's zoom in on a really cool case study. It's a model called S-similarity. And what it does is it takes all these ideas we've been discussing and points them at one of the most complex things you can imagine, the human body. So, similarity combines a bunch of these techniques, including that triplet loss method we started with, and it uses them to build this massive foundational model of human cells. You can think of it as a search engine, but for cells. A scientist can take one cell from a patient, pop it into the search, and find the closest matches from this huge reference library.
And when I say huge, I am not kidding. Get this, the reference atlas for similarity has data from over 23 million individual cells. At that kind of scale, having efficient methods like proxies isn't just a nice bonus, it's absolutely essential. You couldn't do it otherwise.
And really, this brings us to the most important point of all. The progress we're seeing here, it's not just about making bigger and bigger AI models, or just feeding them more data. It's about finding smarter, more efficient, and even more geometrically correct ways to get at that fundamental question. What does it really mean for two things to be alike?
So that leaves us with one last question to chew on. We started this journey by teaching a machine to tell faces apart. Now we're building search engines for human cells. Just imagine, if we keep getting better at teaching machines what similar truly means, what other giant, maybe even unsolvable problems could we finally start to crack?